any ceasefire cannot just be the same ceasefires that don't last that we've seen for the last few years. Tehran is looking to get past that cycle. I think most people are surprised by the extent of these demands and how very clearly they communicate a victory almost for Iran. There is a generation of the IRGC that finally understands that the status quo was no longer working, that the Middle East is changing after October 7th. This is a different region, this is a different war, and it calls for a new approach.
After Trump announced a ceasefire with Iran, the world awoke on Wednesday expecting a calmer Middle East. US President Trump said that Iran's 10-point list of demands provided a workable basis on which to negotiate a longer-term peace, with direct talks expected to begin in Islamabad on Friday. Instead, a wave of Israeli strikes across Lebanon killed over 250 people. Iran fired missiles at the Gulf states, and the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. As apocalyptic scenes unfolded across Lebanese cities, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said the US must choose a ceasefire or the continuation of war through Israel, but it cannot pursue both. But a lot about the ceasefire still remains uncertain. Some of Iran's demands are thought to include a complete removal of sanctions, charges on ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, an acceptance of its nuclear enrichment program, and the withdrawal of US forces from the region, terms likely unacceptable to the US, Israel, and the Gulf states. Yet Trump claimed that almost all of the points of past contention have been agreed, adding that a full agreement would be finalized within the next 2 weeks. So how robust is this ceasefire? And do the parties know exactly what they're agreeing to? To learn more, I spoke to Dr Renad Mansour, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. I want to begin by asking you about the latest news we've seen, that there is this 2-week ceasefire between the US and Iran, and during that time they will negotiate some kind of a final agreement. From what we've seen of their demands so far, there's still a big gap between their negotiating positions. How likely is it that that gap can be closed in the next couple of weeks?
I think it would be very unlikely for the gap to be closed in the next 2 weeks. I think most people are surprised by just how the extent of these demands, how maximalist they are, and how very clearly they communicate a victory almost for Iran out of all of this. Because of that, it's hard to see the US, but certainly Israel as well, which has not really been included in some of the negotiations, in this way at least, agreeing to it. So, Iran, from its perspective, is now looking at a conflict that will most likely be a protracted attrition conflict. And any ceasefire cannot just be the same ceasefires that don't last that we've seen for the last few years. It needs to be something more durable. And it has time, and it will just wait time until some of these demands that could look like a more lasting peace could meet. The US, on the contrary, is in a rush. The US President Donald Trump, wants to prove that this was a quick and easy, shock and awe military campaign that removed the supreme leader and to some extent changed the regime. What the US President Trump does not want is to be stuck in a protracted conflict for the rest of this year at least. Therefore, the ceasefire, is a good start. I think, of course, a lot of people are happy that the bombs will, to some extent, lighten up. But it's hard to see this ceasefire as it is, or even the next 2 weeks, leading to a durable peace.
As you mentioned, some of these demands coming out of Iran do seem quite maximalist. Given the role that optics have played during this war, do you see a lot of that being geared towards domestic audiences to support a narrative of victory? Or do you think, they actually do feel they have the upper hand and they are willing to press and stall and delay until they can move the US to meet them? I mean, even if we already look at how the US has changed its objectives from the start of the war until now, do you think the message taken in Tehran is this is a matter of time, and if we just keep on, we can get them to shift even closer towards those demands later on?
I think potentially both your factors are true, both in terms of, as you say, Iran feeling a bit emboldened following its sort of tactical victory in securing the Strait of Hormuz and turning this battle into one of not just the region, but of the global economic system. But at the same time, I would add Another factor driving these maximalist demands beyond, as you put it out, the sort of domestic needs to show their population, their negotiations success, as well as their feeling emboldened. And the third is, as I said, this is a structurally different approach that the Iranian regime is taking to this war. This is no longer the cycle of ceasefires that don't last, negotiations that are interrupted by American or Israeli attacks. Tehran is looking to get past that cycle. It's lost value in just a deal for the sake of it. It's had multiple of its deals sort of changed or ended. It's had several of its negotiations abruptly ended by attacks. So the third factor I would add to this is that Iran is in a position to be maximalist because it is seeing this as a longer term war, not just a cycle of tactical losses. And second, it's looking to change the status quo. It's no longer holding on to the status quo in the region. It recognizes that the Middle East is changing after October 7th. And Israel is certainly at the forefront of a changing Middle East. And Iran, which probably was for several years too long trying to hold on to the status quo, has now recognized that this is changing. So I would add that to what is fueling these maximalist set of demands.
As you know, trying to recreate deterrence after the status quo has failed Iran is a key element of how it's gone about this war. And the Strait of Hormuz has provided a notable piece of leverage in that attempt. How do you think Iran's approach to the Strait of Hormuz and its approach to many other items on the ceasefire list fit into its desire to recreate deterrence and kind of reshape the strategic reality in the region? What does it consider the most important factors to rebuilding that?
From a military perspective, it was clear that Iran was so far penetrated by Israeli intelligence, by American intelligence, that Iran could not control its skies, its military's, missile defense, to some extent worked, but it was, in nowhere near comparable to what the US and Israel could unleash on Iran. And therefore, it decided to open up a different battleground, an economic one. It showed that if the US and Israel are going to continue to be these aggressors, from Iran's perspective at least, it would need to make the whole world feel the pain of its chaos. And you're seeing that. I mean, global markets, the price of oil, shipping, it's such a strategic and important strait, 20% of world oil coming through it.
I wonder, though, how much of that leverage gained during wartime can actually persist into peacetime. So Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said that, Iran's military forces would retain control of the strait and kind of, control of decisions about shipping passing through. They've suggested a tolling system. How actionable is that as kind of a permanent status quo coming out of the war? Like once they, during the ceasefire, apparently reopen the strait, can they really maintain such close control, or do they kind of have to accept giving up some of that leverage?
It's definitely a bargaining position. As Iran negotiates with the US, one of the conditions is what happens in the strait. This was not even a starter prior to this war. So Iran has definitely developed or gained a bargaining hand or bargaining card in the negotiations that was not there prior, at least in this way. To what extent will Iran continue its plan of establishing a toll booth system for all shipping that goes through the strait? That's a big change if it happens. It will change the whole nature of how the Gulf countries, run these supply chains and their economies as well. So it's very difficult at this moment to see the extent to which this toll booth system will be enacted or not. But for now, what we can confidently say is it's a bargaining chip that has now appeared in Iran's hands that was not there necessarily in this way before.
I suppose, yeah, even despite the feasibility of instituting a toll system, it could always say it's going to do so and then kind of give that up as a chip in negotiations to extract something, even if it never had serious plans to do so either way. I wonder then, does this issue of the strait in kind of creating that new strategic reality, how does it affect other chips or deterrents that Iran once thought it had? The nuclear issue, ballistic missiles, and also perhaps one that's lost its most value, feel free to disagree, but its axis of resistance across the region. Do you think that some of these items will be seen as less valuable cards than they were before because they've kind of been pushed down the list, as it were?
Well, I think what is a clear structural change in this war versus previous conflicts since October 7th that Iran was fighting is that the focus is much more on the Gulf. And the focus is much more on the maritime and less so on the Levant or the axis of resistance groups. Although keep in mind that in Lebanon, Hezbollah was active in response from the get-go. So were the Islamic resistance groups in Iraq. The Houthis, quiet for a long time, have also gotten involved to a lesser extent. So the axis is still there. But from Iran's reconsidering of its sort of security doctrine, of its defense sort of posture, it's decided that the Axis may have some role, but this is a different region, this is a different war, and it calls for a new approach. And part of that new approach is taking the war not into the Levant, but more directly into the Gulf.
I also noted in one of your pieces you wrote was that many of these groups, having been badly degraded over the past 2.5 years since October 7th, have chosen to prioritize kind of internal survival, political control in the countries they operate, rather than necessarily involving themselves so boldly in regional conflicts. Do you think that, given the scale of regional isolation, the damaged relations with the Gulf states and so on, its weakened axis, that will change the way in which it looks to project power across the region or deter its enemies across the region?
The logic of forward defense for Iran was so that there would be no war on Iranian soil, that it could fight its battles in Lebanon or in Syria or Iraq or, in Yemen, elsewhere, Palestine. So one, the logic of that is changing because Iran is more directly in an interstate war with Israel, with the US. So that's a big change. In that context, in the context of an interstate war, the utility of these groups changes. It certainly diminishes because forward defense doesn't help Iran if it's fighting directly. I guess to some extent as well, the logic of these groups will also change. These groups need to survive domestically in their countries. Hezbollah needs to survive within the Lebanese state. The groups in Iraq, the PMF, need to survive within the Iraqi state. The Houthis, are developing the Yemeni state. The reality is you cannot only be an Iranian proxy and survive. You need to also represent communities in those areas. And so it becomes a balancing act. To some extent, some of the groups might not want to be part of a wider war that might actually jeopardize the gains that they have made in Baghdad or in Beirut or elsewhere. But at the same time, we know that the IRGC has strong relations with these groups. And so there will be times where the IRGC will be working with Hezbollah to defend against Israel or to fight against Israel. There will be times when they're working with the Islamic resistance groups in Iraq and with the Houthis. So it's a balancing act by these groups in acts of resistance in this game of survival. Right now, they are all in survival mode. To survive, they need to stay local. They need to have local power and authority. And at the same time, they need to still maintain that transnational network.
You mentioned the IRGC, and I want to ask you how they're looking at this moment and whether they see this as a chance to kind of press these maximalist demands to really lock in a permanent deterrence, or whether they think that at some point a more conciliatory, pragmatic stance is needed, as you mentioned, for their own survival, if nothing else, in terms of, having places to, dodge sanctions across the region, having support from former allies, economic sources of revenue. How do you see that balancing act between trying to restore deterrence and ensuring these attacks aren't repeated, but also the reality of needing the economic and diplomatic sources of power to sustain its leadership?
So I think for the last few years, at least, Iran has, whilst maintaining, of course, strong ties with Iraq, in particular, which is the economic key for Iran's policies under sanctions. But also they maintain, of course, some ties with Hezbollah and Houthis over economic sort of needs. At the same time, Iran has also developed ties with Gulf countries. And I think that's where the balancing looking ahead will be most crucial. I mean, the fact that these countries all share the strait, the fact that a lot of Iran's oil and gas energy that was coming out, that was still sanctioned, still passed through waters of, the UAE and others, and this has all been documented and reported on, showed that Iran was moving towards an economy that was not just axis of resistance, but it was beyond it. Iran was looking to diversify, and China and India, China in particular being a key market for Iran's economy. So what's happening in Iran right now, as the IRGC consolidates its power, I think there is a generation of the IRGC that finally understands that the old way, that the status quo was no longer working. The killing of Khamenei presents an opportunity for some of these different views and visions to come into the forefront and to guide Iran's policy moving forward. So I think what we should expect moving forward is an Iranian regime that is more maximalist, but that is also looking to revise the balance of power in the region.
Interesting. That doesn't exactly bode extraordinarily, hopefully, for the prospects of this ceasefire. I suppose I'll end by asking you, when you look at these list of demands, which do you feel most optimistic about in terms of reaching some kind of common ground with the US and its allies in the region? And which do you think will prove to be actually the real sticking points in this diplomatic process?
I think, Iran's demands, those that sort of look at the US no longer being an aggressive power and the end of US aggression. I mean, this is something that the US also is interested in. I mean, the President Trump has made it clear that he was hoping and planning for this to be a very quick war. In a year where there will be elections in the US, where this is becoming potentially an important factor in the legacy of the Trump presidency, something like an ending US aggression potentially is something wanted on both sides. I think what's more important is to look at the ones that will be the spoilers. Those issues that we've been discussing, like Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, the lifting of Iran's sanctions. These are the kinds of demands that make this war seem like a victory to Iran if these demands are met. I mean, Iran before this war was a heavily sanctioned country that was going through an economic crisis. If it comes out of this war able to sell its energy through global markets, if it has control over the Strait of Hormuz, if these economic demands are met, this will be an empowered Iran. So that's the way I would look at it. And I think that's why Israel in particular, potentially Gulf states and the US will be very wary of these demands, especially those spoiler ones.
At the same time, though, would that sanctions relief in a similar way to the JCPOA in 2015, would that not then provide those kind of peace dividends that would encourage compliance from Tehran? So kind of working both ways then and kind of trying to manage that behavior going forward?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, going back to a JCPOA model and sanctions relief for compliance on ballistic missiles, of course, on the nuclear program, would be a positive piece and a durable piece, certainly. I think the point that I would make is if you look at where Iran was before and where it is after this war, if it is able to have some of this economic recovery, it'll be crucial for it to recover from the military infrastructure defeat. So I do think you're right that the spirit of a lasting peace needs to address these economic sanctions, but the questions around the Strait of Hormuz and how Iran's posture will inevitably change in the Gulf, not just, in other arenas where Iran became so powerful after 2003, but also in the Gulf. I think that's something to look at moving forward.
Certainly, yeah. There's I think a long way to go before they get to that level of recovery. Dr. Renad Mansour, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to hear your analysis, and hopefully we'll be speaking again soon.